Hello and welcome back to the Advancing Healthcare Innovation Show. I am your host, Michael Stamatinos. And if you're new to us, man, we're really excited to have you here because we're just bringing some very exciting conversations with leaders that are painstakingly shaping the future of healthcare. And we happen to be very, very passionate around access and leadership, as well as innovation adoption. So if it's your first time tuning in, let me just tell you a little bit briefly what we're trying to get done here. So we're focused on bringing true stories of innovation to life. And our aim is focusing on people that are in the trenches, getting the work done, and to be able to give them the opportunity to highlight some of those stories to our community and ultimately to our platform in the world. We've got an amazing action-packed year with some incredible speakers, two of which we're going to introduce here shortly. But if you haven't done so, make sure you hit the subscribe button now to get any new interviews coming directly in your inbox. Our field, things are fast evolving, and it's just been crucial to have leaders that can not only envision the future, embrace innovation, but also talking about how to address some of these pressing challenges that we're in. And you're in for a treat today because we kind of have a 2-for-1 special going on this episode. So we're really excited to welcome two distinguished guests on the show. First, we have the esteemed Dr. Randy Brazie, a psychiatrist who specializes in child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. Dr. Brazie brings with him over 2 decades of experience in both clinical settings and healthcare innovation. He's renowned for his compassionate approach and his dedication to improving mental health services and education. And joining him is Dr. Jeffrey VanderPal, a multifaceted professional who wears a few hats as a professor in finance, an author and an entrepreneur, bringing over 30 years of rich experience in finance and business. And Dr. VanderPal has significantly contributed to academic leadership and has taught on 4 continents. So he and Dr. Brazie are also co-founders and managing members of the Neuro Consulting Group, combining neuroscience with effective business decision-making strategies to enhance leadership and organizational outcomes. Together, they've also co-authored the groundbreaking book, The Steadfast Leader: Control Anxiety, Make Confident Decisions, and Focus Your Team Using the New Science of Leadership. So this work really illuminates the path for leaders to navigate through the complexities of leadership with confidence, backed by the findings of neuroscience and psychology. So today we're setting to kind of dig in deep and dive into their insights, into their wisdom, and these innovative approaches, intersecting both leadership and mental health, and how their work is reshaping the landscape of leadership in the modern world. So, doctors, welcome to the show. Great to see you both.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. So let's dig in a little bit. Before we kind of dive into the book, we don't normally have 2 guests. We've had this on a few different occasions. Talk about the chemistry of working together, how you're both all connected, and then we can kind of dig into some of the things around the book.
Sure, Jeffrey.
Usually I start here and talk about how this all happened. So it's interesting. Randy and I have been friends for years, and through our friendships, we're always talking about like business, leadership, talking about psychology and psychiatry. And one day we're having dinner about 3 years ago, and I was just fascinated. I was asking him questions about the work he was doing in somatic experience, some of the trauma work that he was working in, this general question about psychology and psychiatry. And we're just having a really fascinating conversation over dinner one night. And he started asking some questions about leadership. We just kind of got in this conversation. I said, this is really fascinating. I'm not aware in the literature or anything I've read that talks about elements of what you're talking about, especially with like trauma, stress, using polyvagal theory, neuroception, some of these other concepts he was talking about with me in a leadership context or in a business decision-making context. And I thought, there's a gap in the literature. There needs to be more introspective focus on leadership and management. It's really lacking in that area. And business schools aren't really teaching that, or they're not teaching it very well. And so that gap has led to poor management and poor leadership as well. And so we just kind of developed this conversation further and further. And before long, we're jotting down on a napkin in the restaurant, hey, let's write some articles. Maybe we should write a book. And here we are today, multiple peer-reviewed research articles published and a book, and we're on our second book as well that we're working with potentially a publisher on. So we've made a lot of headway, a lot of progress, and a lot's developed in the last couple of years.
A lot of people, I could say, not a lot, but a few people that I know that have gotten together and say, hey, let's do something together. Let's write. Not many execute on it. So it's interesting to see that you both have executed on it. Dr. Brazie, did you want to comment or share anything before I kind of dig in?
No, I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up, pretty well. And, we were really struck with how organizational psychology, traditional leadership theories have focused really heavily on what we call cognitive psychology, using your thinking brain, which has contributed a lot. I mean, this is no denigration to those areas of research. But what we know is that there's a lot more to the brain. And so we really are just bringing in additionally these concepts of how do you work with what we call the nonverbal brain, and how might that be applied to anything from delivering healthcare to making business organizations function better.
Interesting. So as I was kind of prepping for this conversation, your book, it sort of stands at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and leadership. And there's a lot of leadership books out there. Could you sort of share an anecdote or an insight that really encapsulates the moment that you realized that these domains really ought not to and can't operate in silos? And how does this integration redefine the future landscape of effective leadership?
Well, we found great gaps in the literature regarding this when we started researching this further. After we wrote the book, we realized we might be onto something really interesting. When we started submitting it to publishers, McGraw-Hill Professional actually grabbed it fairly quickly. And, being first-time publishers, we're kind of surprised by that, but we're very fortunate. Having said that, they recognized this filled a gap that's very different than other leadership books out there. So that was for us kind of a true test that, hey, we may be onto something that's very unique and we're filling a gap that hasn't been filled yet. And they recognized that and supported that, which was fantastic. So that was the starting point of, I think we're onto something here that could really develop into something much bigger.
And what have been some of the practical use cases where you've applied it? Give us some any stories, examples of where you've seen folks say, hey, this is different, and then how did they apply it?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at different organizations, I previously was the chief medical officer at a local nonprofit called Resilient Health in Maricopa County, Arizona. And they were one of the first healthcare organizations to really bring in and implement elements of polyvagal theory, which is the foundation or the backbone of a lot of the approach that we use. And what they have found is that by starting to incorporate these concepts from neuroscience without having to go and be a neuroscientist, people don't have to train to be a therapist. But by simply using these concepts, what they found is that it reduced turnover. So there was higher retention. But not only that, then when they were looking at things like their net promoter scores, that they were actually doing better, that the patients, the customers enjoyed and seemed to have less concerns and complaints as people learn how to do better jobs at customer service or better handle communication. In addition to that, then teams also found that they were starting to function more efficiently, and getting through complex, as you can only imagine in the public healthcare sector, all the regulations and different rules, federal, state, things like that. In addition to just the burden, right? There's a lot of need for healthcare, especially in mental health. And so what they found is it just kind of helped them to handle the almost at times overwhelming amount of need that was out there, and helping to work with people who are in high degree of stress. And so what we've seen is when you apply this to non-healthcare industries, we're starting to get some feedback that organizations find it works better as far as managing teams, leading teams, getting people to feel like they're engaged and included. So it kind of draws very similarly from concepts like adaptive leadership, where they talk about how do you negotiate relationships and figure out things, and how do you deal with conflict and so forth. So this is why we're pretty excited about this continuing to be adopted as we start to see more and more stories of successes.
It just seems as though as the timing of this couldn't be better. And maybe you knew something a couple of years ago, given where we are today with crises and things that are popping up. So these are timely insights into really managing anxiety and making confident decisions under pressure. And I think now more today in healthcare, and especially in the delivery of care, there's more pressure. You know, what do you say to a frontline leader that's grappling with lots and lots of pressure to deliver key results? How do they deal with pressure? You know, what would your sort of advice be to them through the context and the lens of this framework?
Well, I don't know, Fran, if you want to speak first to that from a healthcare perspective.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And then, of course, you know very well leadership, which applies to all industries.
Yeah.
But ultimately, you know, one of the concepts that we talk about is how do you deal with all these, you know, stressful situations? And the real key, the real sort of, if you get to the nugget of it, is that when we are under stress, our brains respond a certain way. And though we look like we're talking and walking and functioning normally, we actually have kind of a disconnect between our thinking brain and our more primitive instinctive parts of the brain, which is where your stress response comes from. So really, it's the key is first you have to know thyself, right? How am I as a person responding to stress? And then from there, learning what is it that shifts me into a stressful state, what actually helps me get out of a stressful state. And then also, what are the skills that I can use to help me shift myself when I want to? And so this is what we call interoception, awareness of what's going on in your body from the neck down. And it's kind of a mindfulness approach, but it's not strict mindfulness. So the first things that we teach people is learning themselves, how do their systems react, and then how can they start to regulate or shift themselves. Because when you do that, then things like leadership decisions, prioritizing and stuff become a little bit easier. And I don't know, Jeffrey may have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of trends over the years with more and more toxicity in the workplace, which is of great concern. And, you know, anecdotally, I have friends who work in various corporate environments that talk about the toxicity they're dealing with. But, you know, you can read about news and studies that have been done in
Yeah.
different circumstances. And, you know, this is an ongoing problem. Why is there so much toxicity in the workplace? What is happening that's causing all these problems? And if you look at the cost of turnover from these toxic type of workplaces, it's tremendous. If there was, I always, you know, in my classes, I talk to students, if there was a line item on the spreadsheet, basically it says what's the cost of turnover for the organization. I don't think any organization really monitors it from that perspective, but there literally was a expense line on the P&L that actually said here's your cost for turnover. I think companies would take a very different approach and be much more mindful and sensitive to what's going on in the workplace, and try to create a less toxic workplace and invest more into training and support programs to create less of a toxic workplace. So the average cost of turnover, this is for a low level, more entry level white collar position. We're not talking about senior levels. It's $35,000 per employee is the average cost for turnover for a low level white collar worker. So looking at those costs, and there's other added costs that can go along with that, times hundreds and hundreds or thousands of employees at a company that turn over in a given year. And all of a sudden, you can be in millions of dollars very quickly, hitting the bottom line. And loss of productivity, which is also factored into part of that. But so there's ongoing effects. It can affect customer service. It can affect retaining other employees. I mean, there's a whole host of problems that emanate from that. So being sensitive to that, and understanding that cost and the issues associated with it are so critically important.
And you said a few things that triggered a couple different thoughts. And same thing with what you said, Dr. Brazie, earlier. And I'm just reflecting on a time when one of my mentors was telling me, he's like, Michael, you know, good employees, they don't leave organizations. They leave bad leaders and leave bad managers. And you mentioned something, Dr. Brazie, about knowing thyself. What is it about leaders when they're placed into positions, maybe they're not well equipped. Do they even have the time to introspectively look at themselves? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the nice thing is that a lot of these skills don't take a lot of time. So, and if you practice them, you can actually learn them on the fly and to be able to utilize them fairly rapidly and also fairly discreetly. So in essence, like, it doesn't mean you have to set up incense and candles in your office and turn off the lights for that sounds probably appealing to some people.
Yes.
But really, and first of all, about learning yourself is you start to build over time an awareness of like, oh, I'm getting that tension in my neck, or oh, I notice my heart's beating faster, my sympathetic nervous system, my fight or flight's kicking in. And now what do I do about that, right? So by using simple regulation skills, you can down regulate self from, fight or flight down to at least like, okay, I can do this. I'm not going to react. Because what happens is when fight or flight kicks in, or if a person becomes overwhelmed, if their nervous system thinks I'm in some kind of danger and I ain't getting out of it, we kind of shut down. This is where people, what we call dissociate. So they look like they're functional, but nothing's going in. They're not really
But they're just totally checked out.
totally checked out. I don't know if you read, but just recently in the news, there was a story about a 58-year-old woman. I believe it was in Nevada, and she was in a hotel swimming pool, looked like she was swimming around, but was holding onto the railing, and she drowned because she wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying out help, but she froze. And so people walked by, had no clue that this woman was struggling, and she drowned and died. So it's kind of a very salient point that shows you that we shift between these states. Now, originally they were developed, we think, to help you. Like if a lion leaps out at you, you have to be able to fight or flee, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you can't get away from the lion, you immobilize, you freeze and shut down so that either you don't feel you're passing, or maybe the predator, the lion, will get bored, think something's wrong with you and then just leave you alone. The problem is these old things get triggered, these old responses get triggered by modern stresses. So learning how you react, learning how to shift and adapt yourself. But we also kind of go in the book over a lot of other skills that leaders may want to use. And to really be aware of your tone of voice, of your eye contact, your facial expressions, or even just the temperature, lighting, and colors, the physical layout of the place you're working in. So this gets to the last thing I'll say about this is whether we are giving people cues of safety or cues of danger. And the nervous system is constantly scanning all of us, all three of us right now are doing this automatically. We're always looking for signs of danger because survival is the number one priority.
So unbeknownst to someone, they could be giving a cue out that triggers someone into something that happened to them years ago. Give you a perfect example, actually. This is and I'd love to kind of get your reactions to this, but client, a woman working in an organization, high capacity leader, new commercial leader comes in that she's working underneath. The new leader is he's very, let's just call it, he's a bulldozer. Very, very low EQ. And other person worked historically for a leader similar. Terrible experience. She ended up having to leave. So every time this leader engages and communicates with this new leader, it's basically taking her back to that. How does someone get out of that funk?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned this because this is something that Jeffrey was just talking about in an interview we were doing recently. And I don't know, what are your thoughts about that, Jeffrey, about how a leader might be able to address that, or a worker?
Yeah. Well, if the leader's not self-aware of how they're being perceived by other people, obviously that's problem one. But number two, the individual, the lady who is being affected by this, and these old emotions are coming back because of the present day issue that she's dealing with, this new boss or leader that she's dealing with. It's really going to be incumbent upon her to be able to regulate herself in a way that allows her to keep herself more calm and less stressed. And there are regulation exercises, things that she can do to help do that.
What are some examples of some of those regulation exercises?
Well, it could be, and Randy can talk more to this, but there's certain breathing exercises, just being, even making notes and writing down when certain things stress you out, and being able to recognize that and be able to accept and deal with that in a way emotionally where you can down regulate yourself and say, okay, I know the
Mm.
way this person talks to me or certain words they say to me trigger me, and it makes me nervous, or it makes me want to just run, basically get out of the situation. I need to say, okay, I can deal with this. I can accept this. I can regulate myself and not let this affect me in the same way it has in the past. It takes some time to do that. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, this isn't
No.
immediate, but this is great.
But there are certain exercises that can be used in order to do that. You know, you could say they could even have a somewhat honest conversation with that leader if they're really uncomfortable. But again, it really depends upon the dynamic between those two individuals. That could go well, it may not go so well. So it really depends upon that dynamic, and that individual may be very uncomfortable even broaching that subject matter. So, but at the end of the day, the individual is going to have to learn how to manage that stress in some way and deal with it. And that's not always easy to do, obviously. You know, most people will just leave the situation. They'll quit and find a new job. That's why you have the high
Yeah,
turnover rates,
yeah,
which is really unfortunate that that happens. Um, by trying to better educate leaders across the board to understand um, what we're trying to illustrate here in terms of um, polyvagal theory, understanding oneself, being more introspective, understanding others better, how to relate to other people and relate to yourself in a more healthy way. I think it's critically important to reduce a lot of these issues in the workplace.
right.
So we can't just throw it all on one individual. This really is going to be a group or a collective effort to educate people to be better leaders across the board. That's going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight either. And when that's what we're really trying to do with our articles, our books, our consulting work, we're just trying to educate people, say, hey, look, there's an alternative. This may work really well. You know, if you practice some of these ideas and these concepts, you can have a much less toxic and much more engaging and effective workplace, and people are going to be happier. And we've seen that.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it really gets to the idea that you want to have that time lapse between stimulus and response. So if that boss is doing something that's the bulldozer, if there can be a little gap in time between the response that she would have. And you gain that power by first learning yourself, saying, okay, I'm getting triggered. That means I can do something about that rather than just react to it. And that kind of gets to mindfulness again, although our training is not just an adoption of mindfulness, there are mindfulness aspects. Um, because of course she wouldn't be able to change the boss's behavior necessarily, but she can change, as Jeffrey alluded to, herself, how she responds or reacts. So it's learning to gain a little bit of self-confidence, self-regulation. That goes a long way to helping people so that then later, if they do need to set those boundaries, have a meeting with the boss or HR, that at least they're doing it from a much more empowered place, and they're more present psychologically as well as physically because they're not checked out, they're not dissociated.
Yeah. You mentioned about that around this notion of vulnerability in leadership. And there's been a lot of literature on that, but how do you, at least from where I guess my growing up, my tours of duty, how do you convince leaders that showing vulnerability is a strength and not a weakness, especially, in corporate culture?
You see elements of this in servant leadership.
Yeah,
There's all these different leadership models out there. Randy alluded
yeah,
to it, leadership. That's one model. Another model is servant leadership. And you don't see this used as much, but I really think it's a powerful leadership model that can be taught and used. And the whole focus is it's not so much that the leader or manager is the power structure itself, the boss. It's that they're there to support the group or the individuals working with them and for them, and
mm,
empowering the people that work for them, understanding that the employee's success is their success, taking the ego out of the equation. Now,
mm,
depending on the personality of the individual, that might be very difficult to do, obviously, but it's a process. But servant leadership is one way by utilizing that model along with some of the other elements that we teach and we consult on regarding neuroscience. By combining those two, you can create an environment where you have a much more supportive leadership and management model where the employees feel more empowered, they feel more supported, and basically it lowers turnover quite a bit.
Hmm. Anything to add to that, Dr. Brazie?
Yeah, no, I think, Jeffrey really described that well. It's kind of gets to the idea of what we call neuroception, which actually was coined by Stephen Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory. And it's, how I mentioned our nervous systems are scanning. Well, that's neuroception is we're also kind of scanning each other. So I'm scanning the two of you to see, are you guys noticing any signs of danger that I need to pay attention to?
Hmm.
And so we are really actually quite highly connected to each other as humans. And he talks about that connection with each other is a biologic imperative. Like we have to be able to feel safe and to connect with each other to thrive as human beings. And so this really kind of highlights what Jeffrey was talking about, that how the leader and the followers or the people on the team together interact with each other. Can they do it in a way that generates a sense of safety and then creativity and play? Or is it a sense of fear and danger and I just have to put my head down and get through it? So these are fundamental concepts, thinking about how are we as human beings interacting with each other.
Interesting. I've lots going through my mind. However, I want to sort of stay focused and stay on track because you said a few things around leadership. And is there any bit of, just even to the point of discussing, bits of outdated leadership advice that's somehow still widely accepted? However, through some of these recent scientific findings have been negated. Do any of those come to your mind?
Authoritative leadership models. It doesn't work well. Temporarily, for a very short period of time, you might get a little more productivity out of your employees. But at the end of the day, that's going to wane and they're going to leave. Those models don't work well in most every environment. So those are old, antiquated, outdated models. So anything that's more authoritative generally doesn't work very well.
Yeah, and actually, Jeffrey brings up an excellent point because a lot of the research is showing that for younger generations, the less authoritative models are much more effective and successful for organizations. So organizations, whether they're healthcare or otherwise, need to really keep that in mind when they're starting to think about how they want to train their leaders and have them manage their teams.
People want
we've had,
supportive collaboration. That's ultimately what they really want, supportive collaboration.
yeah, people want to feel like they're part of something as opposed to have nothing to be a part of. And, I'm just noticing, especially in some of the newer generations entering into the workforce, they don't want a job. They want a calling. They're passionate. And there is a sort of a generational divide, and there's this gap that's happening. How do you suggest that more senior leaders that maybe are part of a different generation, how do they close that gap to actually really connect and collaborate better with some of the newer generation of the workforce that's coming in? Are there any tactics that you can suggest that have been really meaningful and helpful and supported and backed by research?
Yeah, that's a good point because you're seeing this happen. I mean, you've seen some CEOs of major companies make these comments about get back to work or you're fired. You know what I mean? And these kind of comments, which really don't sit very well with the employees. I see this in academics as well, at universities where they were going to online courses. Students are really enjoying the online courses, and then they're pulling them all back and going back to on ground. Students are like, wait a minute, I really like the flexibility of online class. Why can't we have both? So you're seeing a lot of, I call the old guard, old thinking, as you alluded to, still creeping into all different industries and elements. And it's hard to change that. And, you know, some people just are not very adaptive, unfortunately, and getting them to change can be very difficult. Some people just don't want to change. And maybe Randy can allude to how you can get people to change. I've experienced from my perspective, if someone is just not someone that wants to be flexible and change, it's very hard to get them to change. Even if you provide a mountain of evidence to them that, hey, this is wrong, this is the better way of doing something, you get somewhat of a cognitive dissonance that occurs that's very hard to get people to make those changes. It's a very slow process. It's like the proverbial cat being dragged across the floor with its claws extended. And some people are very adaptable and like change. Like, I'm someone that loves change. Change doesn't bother me. I'm not threatened by change. But there are some people that, with their personalities and experiences, they're very threatened by change. They don't want to see change happen. Those are individuals that, it takes a lot of patience, a lot of time to try to get them to change.
But looking back to maybe the introspection piece, like, do they really know themselves? Do they have that air of confidence that even when things change, they really still know who they are and they know where their value sort of comes from, as opposed to saying, hey, my value is in the fact that I'm a VP or I'm an SVP or whatever the title might be. But if that changes, oh my gosh, world comes crumbling down. Where do you see that dynamic changing in the future?
Yeah, I think that really gets to what Jeffrey was talking about, is it really equates to fear. And people who are more rigid tend to be more fearful when you do psychological studies on them. And when we are afraid, again, we think there's cues of danger, therefore the brain goes into survival mode, shuts off the cognitive thinking ability to some degree. So you look like you're thinking, but you're really actually not in a fully connected way. So the answer to that is to get people to do that less, is to really start working with them on giving them cues of safety, teaching them regulation skills so that they can calm themselves out of a state of fear. And because once a person feels safe, more connected, then they have that resilience, that adaptability that Jeffrey talked about, where they can roll with change better. And that really just ties across any organization. Look at change management, right? That's such a huge area in multiple industries. And it often is, how do you deal with fear?
Well, then, now that we're all sort of along this line, how do you then feel that organizations can possibly integrate these strategies into their corporate culture without either making employees feel pressured that they have to make these types of changes or even stigmatized? What I'm really trying to ask is, what are some of the baby steps or little micro movements that they can make to incorporate this?
Well, one of the things we share with people are, we have case studies that we can share with individuals. So it's not so much, this is what's happening with you and your company, but they can relate to the case studies, though those situations may be happening to them, but using the case studies as examples. So it allows them to relate to a story, because people relate to stories well, and that's where the case studies come in. And so we can go through examples and case studies to share how certain issues can be toxic to a company in the workplace, and how those issues can be mitigated over time, the techniques and strategies to be used, and what those results could look like over time. And that gives people the impetus to generally not only think about the change, but actually implement that change as well.
Very interesting. There's been a lot of talk around the incorporation of AI into day-to-day workflow. And it sounds like what we've been talking about is creating an environment that can create certain stimuli that occur and people react to those. Where do you see AI fitting into this in terms of the intersection of all these things that you're talking about? And I'm just sort of curious if you guys have thought about this, incorporating it in some way, shape, form. How do you think that gets impacted with the usage of AI?
I don't think AI is going to be the job killer that some people are making it out to be. We
Yeah.
said the same thing about the computers and the internet and the transistor. So when we go through these technological and robotics, we go through these technological revolutions or evolutions. You always get the fear mongering that comes because of the unknown. Again, oh my gosh, we're all going to lose our jobs over this. And what has happened with the advent of technology? Yes, there's been some shifts. Yes, some people did lose their jobs. People had to be retrained, but we actually had a growth in jobs through these technologies. And life has
Hmm.
gotten easier. I mean, you compare our life to 100 years ago to today, there's no equivalency. I mean, our lives are immensely easier. And even people who might consider themselves, working poor or poorer today in America still have a substantially better life today than they would have had 100 years ago. So we've had substantial improvements, increases in productivity, increases in improvement in lifestyle, and wealth, in so many areas. Are there some downsides to it? Sure, of course. It's not all, rainbows and sunshine, but at the end of the day, net, there's been huge gains to be made and have been made. And I look at AI as being an opportunity to make work and life a bit easier for all of us. And yes, there'll be some shifts, and for some people, it'll be negatively affected initially over time. But I think for most of us, it's going to be a net win or a gain. There'll just be a little bit of adaptation here and there, but I think it will actually improve our lives.
Dr. Brazie?
Yeah, it's interesting because it also leads to this idea, like, again, we talk about connection, biological connection between people. And, the use of AI, if people start to treat it as if it's a person, or because it can fool your brain, right? And because it can sound pretty natural in how it's
Yes.
responding. And of course, there's all this focus now on people using AI in some ways to ease loneliness or social isolation. It will be interesting to see how that evolves over time because our nervous systems actually can pretty much scent out if it's another being connecting to us or not. So it'll be very fascinating to see what kind of impact that might have on the human brain, this neuroception process. Because
Hmm.
with AI, there's not another creature sending you signals, it's a computer, right? Algorithm and software. But ultimately, it can provide a lot of benefit, for in many fields of medicine. For example, the use of AI will be profoundly impactful and helpful because there's just so much knowledge to learn anymore that it's hard. I feel for the young medical students now, what they have to learn is vastly more than what I did when I went through medical school many moons ago.
Hmm. Interesting. So how do folks learn more about your work? Where can they go to follow just this work personally is very, I mentioned it earlier, it's so timely. I feel like it's such a need and it ought to be a prioritization. Sometimes it's not, but share with us how people can follow what you guys are doing and how they can best, I guess, learn more.
We are on LinkedIn, and also we have a website, which is neuroconsultinggroup.com. And there we've linked a book as well as an online recorded video training series that we have that's based on our book, Steadfast Leader. There's also a website if people go to steadfastleader.com. But the book's also available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and a few other sellers, right, Jeffrey?
Yes.
And watch this space because we will be finding a publisher and working to publish our book on how to implement polyvagal theory in healthcare on both the administrative and the clinical delivery side, and how that might help healthcare organizations.
The use case is there 100%.
Yeah.
It's there. You've lived through it, so you understand it.
Yeah.
And if there's one bit of advice for someone who's listening to this conversation that they can actively take, because we talk about, innovation isn't just about being idle. It's about doing, it's about applying. What's the one thing that someone can take from this discussion and apply?
There
Dr.
are
Brazie, we'll start with
solutions.
you, or I'm sorry, you can start, Dr. VanderPal.
I would just say that there are solutions to problems, and we provide some solutions to help individuals that are having issues with stress or trauma in the workplace, how to deal with their own issues and being more introspective, but also how to deal with other individuals as well in the workplace, and to create more harmony and happiness in the workplace. And again, I don't want to sound like, we're talking about crystals and aromatherapy candles, even though those can be very nice and very relaxing. But the reality is that there are some simple techniques and mindful elements that you can implement that really can make a big improvement over time in your happiness and your health, your mental health. And if more people implement these strategies, uh, I mean, the improvements could be very substantial over time.
Yeah, and really just like, one doesn't become a gold medalist Olympic athlete trying once, practicing once, is these skills take time. And, and what we are developing are a series of live trainings where people can practice the skills, in dyads or triads, role playing, take the concepts home and work with them. Because the more you do, just like if you're going to the gym for your physical health, then the better you're going to get at it. And this can really make a huge difference in people bridging the gap. Using polyvagal theory and some of the other therapies that come from it, for example, in the field of mental health, it actually speeds up therapy. So people don't have to go into treatment as long. And that's what's so exciting about these approaches. And so that's our hope, is that this can also speed up retention, productivity, success, and also better service delivery, whether you're making widgets or providing healthcare out there in the world.
Yeah, I love the fact that it's agnostic. Like this has applicability to every single niche. We're happen to be talking about healthcare because we're caring for humans, or the delivery of care, or like whether you're making devices like you mentioned. But we're dealing with humans. Human beings are complex beings. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I've had a really good time geeking out with you guys around this. And for those that have tuned in, if you found this content helpful for you, my one ask is would you mind sharing it? Would you mind engaging on what you found to be most useful? What are you going to apply? Let us know what you think, because that'll give us a little bit more of a loop on, what we can work on as well. And as a community, we're always about getting better. We want to make sure that we're continuously making things better. So Dr. Brazie, Dr. VanderPal, great to see you. Look forward to having you on future show when the next book drops, and all the best.
Thank you.